Welcome to Psych with Mike. This is a very special presentation. Back in 2004, Brett and I had the opportunity to do a presentation on substance abuse and parenting issues with adolescents. Going through some files, I found an old copy of this recording, and I thought maybe I would share it with you, and hopefully you will enjoy it. As always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.
What we know is that since the inception of the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Social Sciences, it is the book that holds all of the diagnoses that you can make in the psychological field. Since that book's inception over 30 years ago, substance abuse has been rated the number one problem in our society, the number one psychological problem in our society. Now, substance abuse is not the number one diagnosed disorder in our society. The number one diagnosed disorder is what? Depression. Okay. Depression is overwhelmingly the number one diagnosed disorder, but substance abuse has always been known to be the number one problem. So why is that? The reason is because there's a real disconnect in our society. We do not live in a society of low tolerance. We live in a very, very tolerant society. One of the things that we know, there was a study that just came out earlier this year, but it confirmed studies that have been done over the course of the last 25 years, and that is that the number one thing that correlates with kids who drink and use drugs is what? Parental attitudes on drinking and using drugs. Okay? Our society is extremely tolerant, but what we know for a fact is that society's overall view of drinking and drugging is not what's going to influence your children. What's going to influence your children are your attitudes about drinking and drugging. We can live in an incredibly tolerant society, and yet if the home environment is one of zero tolerance, that has a significantly more important influence on a child's life and on their behavior than the norms in society. One of the things that is a fact is that alcohol manufacturers are the number one sponsor of sporting events in our society. That's just a fact. If you would have been at home, some of you were, just a few minutes before you came here, and you were watching the game, over the course of a 3.5 hour game, you were probably exposed to somewhere between 25 and 30 commercials for alcohol. Okay. Now, why is that? Because alcohol is the number one supporter of sporting events in our society. That's an incredibly strong message. Your kids are exposed to that every day. What is the counterpoint to that? The counterpoint to that is you. Okay? We also know that the age of awareness in our society is now 13 years of age. What that means is that kids become aware of drugs and alcohol. They know where to get them. They know who's using them. They know the colloquial names, the street names for drugs at around age 13. I am recovered. When I began using drugs a long, long time ago, the age of awareness was 16, about 20 years ago. That age has dropped 3 years over the course of the last 20 years, and that age is going to continue to go down. There are so many avenues for your children to learn this information. The question is, do you want them to learn this information on the street, or would you rather them get it from you? There are a lot of myths about drug use and drug abuse in our society. One of the greatest myths in our society is that adolescents cannot become addicted. I grew up in a treatment center. Before I went into private practice, I worked at St. Anthony's Medical Center over in St. Louis. And I worked there for 20 years. It was the only job I ever had before I went into private practice. Most of that time, I worked in the adolescent treatment facility there. And one of the things that I was indoctrinated to in the early age was that adolescents couldn't become addicted. Their brains are so plastic, meaning that their brains are still forming neural connections very readily, very easily. Their brains are still developing. Because of that, what people thought was that adolescents, if they did damage to their brains, that damage could be easily repaired. That's not true. What is actually true is that because their brains are still developing, they are at significantly higher risk for addiction than you and I are. Because the neural pathways that are required to become addicted can be so much more easily set in motion, set in concrete when those individuals are younger than when they are older. So adolescents in our society are at significantly greater risk, and at the same time, the younger a person is, the more likely they are to become addicted. That leads me to another myth in our society. A lot of people in our society believe that alcohol is the gateway drug, meaning that alcohol is the drug that people first start using and that it leads to a lot of other drug use and potentially even illicit drug use. That is not true. Alcohol is not the gateway drug in our society. Tobacco is. Back in the mid-'80s, they started doing clinical studies on cocaine. And the reason was that a very popular basketball player died of a cocaine overdose. And so prior to that, cocaine was seen as a relatively benign drug. Even as short a time ago as the early 70s, cocaine was believed to be completely 100% non-addictive. People believed that the medical community said that we were all going to use cocaine. None of us would ever be overweight. None of us would ever be unhappy. We would live in a utopian society. Guess what? We're not all snorting cocaine. We're not all happy. We're not all supermodels. Okay? Because that was a fallacy. But they didn't know why. In the 1980s, after this young man, Lynn Baez, died, they started doing clinical studies on cocaine. And what they found was that there's a neurotransmitter in your brain called dopamine. And that the amounts of dopamine produced when a person used cocaine were 10 times greater than the amount of dopamine produced when any other substance was used in the human brain. That made cocaine easily the single most addictive substance on the face of the planet. Now we flash forward a decade, and in the early 90s, does everybody remember when people from R.J. Reynolds and the other, oops, I'm not supposed to mention that. Okay. When the tobacco company representatives all went up to Congress and they all raised their right hand and they said, Congressman, yes, I believe that cigarette smoking is not addictive. I have no reason to believe that cigarette smoking is addictive. And they were lying. We had documentation that proved that as early as 1957, that the cigarette companies were actively manipulating the amounts of nicotine in their product to get people addicted. They knew how to do it. They were doing it in the 1950s. They've been doing it ever since. One of the ironies is that I watch these commercials all the time on TV, and I see all of these ads for all of these tobacco producing companies, and they say, come to our website, get information, give it to your kids. We don't want your kids to smoke. Well, that's a lie. If they didn't want your kids to smoke, what would they do? They'd stop making cigarettes. They're still making cigarettes. They want to sell those cigarettes to somebody. When you die, guess who they want to sell them to? They want to sell them to your kids. So that's not true. Now, does that mean you shouldn't go to those websites, that you shouldn't get that information? No, you should go to those websites. You should get that information. And the reason is because in the 1990s, they started doing the same clinical studies on nicotine that they had done a decade ago on cocaine. Guess what they found out? That when a person consumes nicotine, the human brain produces 100 times more dopamine than when a person snorts cocaine. Easily making nicotine the single most addictive substance on the face of the planet, bar none, period. Nicotine is the gateway drug in our society. When are kids in our society introduced to nicotine? When they're 12, 10, 8, younger. They are introduced to the single most addictive substance on the face of the planet at a time when developmentally they have absolutely no defense against it. A child who begins smoking is 6.5 times more likely to abuse drugs in their life than a person who does not. What are some of the things that promote drug use in our society? The number one thing that correlates with kids who use, parents who use. That's not rocket science, that's pretty easy to understand. Parental attitudes are the number one influence on children. There used to be a commercial that was on TV that the dad was talking to the kid and he had a box of cigar box, right? And he's waving it in front of the kid. He says, "Where'd you learn how to do this? Who taught you how to do this? It's got marijuana in it." And the kid said, "It's not saying anything." And the guy keeps shaking the box in front of him. And finally the kid breaks down and he said, "From you, okay? I learned it from watching you." The number one thing that correlates with kids who use are parental attitudes about using. Now, one of the things that you will say is that you talk to your kids and you use responsibly, and I'm sure that that's true. But what I'm here to tell you tonight is that your kids do not see shades of gray. They see black and white. If you think they see shades of gray, you are mistaken. And so if you tell your children, don't use irresponsibly, don't drink and drive, but you go out to eat with them in a car and drink responsibly, have one beer and drive home, your kid has seen you drink and drive. And so when you confront them about it, they are going to say to you, well, you do it. And you're going to sit down and you're going to try and have a logical argument with them about the fact that you drink responsibly and it's different, you're of age. Your kids don't care. Now the question is it worth it to you to set a good example for your child to not do those things? That has to be a personal value judgment. I can't tell you whether you should do that or not. And I'm not here to tell you whether you should do it or not. What I'm here to tell you is that if your kids see you do it, they're going to tell you, you do it, get off my back. So when they say that to you, if they say that, remember, Mike said that they would do that, okay? Because they would. Sometime. Now, I can be an incredibly delusional man. You can call my wife and ask her, she'll confirm that, okay? But I'm 40 years old. You look at an alcohol-related commercial, these individuals are 20-something, they all have perfect bodies, they're walking around on the beach, and life is absolutely perfect. Even at my most delusional, I know I'm not 20 years old with a perfect body. That message is not directed at me. Who's it directed at? Not me. It's directed at your young children, maybe not young. You know, even if they're trying to get the 20 and 21-year-olds, that still has a significant influence on age groups which are younger than that. Those messages are not directed at us. What they know is that if you want to enjoy a cold beverage, watching the Cardinal game, you're going to do that. They know that they've already got your money. They're shooting for new money. That is the point of advertising. If you don't believe that, I think you're naive. I'd like to introduce Brett Newcomb, and he would like to talk to you a little bit about parenting styles. Brett.
Thank you. I've Brett Newcomb 30 years. I'm a parent. I have 2 children. My oldest son is 34. He has survived my parenting. He is independent. He supports himself. He's an emergency room nurse at Barnes Hospital. He's a good guy. My youngest son is 9. He's in the 4th grade, and we're starting all over again, trying to get it right. So I want to talk to you tonight about what Mike has been talking to you about, but in a slightly larger frame. I want to talk to you about parenting, adolescents, and high school, and I want to talk to you about the concepts of parenting that I think are relevant. You may say, well, why? And why now? I mean, yes, it would make sense if we were still grade school parents, or if we were new parents and we were looking at this road before us. But we're almost to the other end of the road, and our kids are almost ready to go out. Well, that just simply is not true. The statistical data that's available to us now tells us that the time frame for first independence, when your child leaves your home and supports himself financially, finally, whenever that comes, is actually delaying every year. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the average age of autonomy is backing up, and right now, the average age of complete autonomy is 27. So you thought you were a couple years away. You're not. Statistically, in this room, at least half your kids are going to go off to college and come home. And some of them are going to come home with husbands, wives, and children. And they're going to want to live in your basement. Now, why would they want to live in your basement? Well, because you control access to the goodies that they're not going to have the income to be able to afford, but they're going to have lived in their lifestyle. And they have been raised by you and by our society with a sense of entitlement and the need for immediate gratification. You have adolescents, so you've seen it. What happens when you start to talk to your adolescent and you go to preacher mode is there's like a little film that comes down over their eyes. They're reptilian. And there's this little film that comes down over their eyes. Lights are on, nobody's home. They stop listening, especially we got dads in the room. Dads, if you ever begin a conversation with your child or with your spouse that starts with, when I was your age, you need to know no one is listening. No one is listening. I mean, you look at your wife and you'll see the same film come down all over her eyes. Yeah, it's magical. No one listens when you start a conversation. That happens all the time. Kids come in, they'll ask for something. Dad, Mom, can I have the car Friday night? And your first response is going to be, what? And they're going to say, can I have the car Friday night? And dads love that question for some reason because they think that's the opportunity to preach the word. And so they say, well, I got to tell you, when I was your age, it wasn't that easy. And they start the speech. And the kids all just go away somewhere for a little while. And if they're polite children, they'll wait passively for a few minutes for you to get rolling in the speech, and then they'll start signaling you that they've already got the message cut to the chase. What's the bottom line? And they signal it with nonverbals and sub-vocalizations. Yeah, and then, because they won't be in a hurry up looking at their watch and something. I got to know, you know. And finally, they'll just stop you and say, I don't have time for this. Just give me the answer, yes or no. And if the answer is no, then they do all that histrionic crap. Your kids don't need you to be their buddy. Your kids need you to be their parents. And what they need at 15, 16, 17 is the same thing they needed at 2, 3, 4. They need boundaries. They need to know where the limit is. The nature of the beast, the nature of the organism. For you, for me, as employees, as workers, as business people, for your kids, what we do is push until we find the limit. We need to know the line. And then we can make, hopefully, if we're mature, we can make an informed decision. If I know where the line is, I know what the cost is. If I know what the cost is, I can make an assessment and say, am I willing to take the hit in order to get this? Do I want this badly enough that I'm willing to take the hit? See, one of the mistakes that parents make in today's world, especially affluent, educated parents, is you believe in the power of the epiphany. You believe that if you explain things to your child and you reason with your child, that your child at 5 or 6, when you're sitting down and explaining to them why they need to be in bed at 8:30 for the 7,382nd straight night, you're having this conversation about why they need to be in bed at 8:30. You talk about health, and you talk about sleep, and you talk about grades, you talk about feeling good in the morning, you talk about getting a good start, you talk about all these things. They're not listening. They're not going to have an epiphany. Your 8-year-old is not going to look at you and go, my God, I get it! I need to go to bed. Your children have not been taught to take the hit because you have protected them from infancy, from the consequences of their choices, by explaining it to them too much. You explain it to them, and they nod their little heads, and you pull back on the punch. You don't give the punch. So, the most common consequence that parents come up with, and you ask the question that so many parents ask when they come to my office, because they say to me, there's nothing that works. There's nothing that works. What can we do? With teenagers, what can we do? You've got to find what you can do. And ideally, you would have started sooner, but if you didn't start sooner, it's still not too late. You can start tonight. You can go home and be different from this day forward. But listen to what I'm going to tell you. Most of you think of consequence and you call it grounded. Young lady, you can't talk to your mother that way. You're grounded. Well, my favorite question when parents say, well, we're grounded, is what does that mean exactly? And they look at each other in confusion and sheepishly say, we don't really know. Most families haven't defined the term. Grounding means something different to everybody that's listening. So as the dad, if I say you're grounded, I may mean you can't drive the car, but of course just for leisure drive, for your own personal. If I need you to take your brother to school in the morning, if I need you to run out and get some milk, or if I need you to go to work so that you can pay for it, well then you drive for those things. But you can't drive like just to go hang with your buddies. Okay? It may mean to mom, you can't get on the computer and instant message. It may mean to me that you can't talk on your cell phone. It means something different to everybody. But in my experience as a teacher, And in my experience as a therapist, and no longer in my experience as a parent, grounding usually ends not when the parent says so. Most parents say you're grounded for the rest of your life. You're grounded for 2 months. You're grounded all semester. Don't ask me for anything. But they don't say, what does that mean? Does that mean your friends can't come on the yard? Does it mean you can't go out? Does it mean you can't watch television? Does it mean you have to stay in your room? Does it mean you have to scrub the kitchen? What does it mean? So parents say you're grounded. And the kid's like, oh, I can't believe you're going to do that. And then a day or 2 or 3 passes. And then the kids just go back to doing what they always did. And it's usually a week before the parents figure out the kid's not grounded anymore. And finally, one of you will look at the other and say, did we unground him? And the other one will say, well, we must have. He's got the car and he's gone. That's the way it ends for most families. The children decide when they're finished with it. And the children decide whether or not they're going to accommodate it. And that's where you make a mistake. Because you've got to raise the level of cognitive dissonance. You've got to create an imbalance in the homeostasis. That's when they learn. We don't learn. Educational theory tells us we don't learn unless there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, emotional imbalance. The art of teaching is in raising that just enough and not too much. Because then you slide over into anxiety. Clinically, we see more and more kids suffering from anxiety and depression in our culture. It's a tough time to be a kid. It's a tough time to be a parent. And sometimes the hardest thing that you can do as a parent is let your kid fall down and get hurt. The hardest thing that you can do as a parent is let your kid hit a wall and don't rescue. The objective of parenting for all of your child's life is what we call socialization. Socialization is what society expects us to do with our children. When we bring them into this world, they have a personality and a biological set of capacities. I mean, maybe you give birth to a newborn child that would be the greatest sword fighter the world has ever seen, but our culture's not going to need that, so you probably won't develop it. But he has a set of potentials. Your job and our job as educators is to build a box around this child and protect him and educate him so that he learns certain things, so that eventually come out the other end of the funnel and be an independent, autonomous, contributing member of society. The objective is to raise them up and let them go. That process is called socialization. And adolescence is the most difficult period of that process. Adolescence is a relatively new thing on the face of the earth. It's only been around about 150 years. Before that time, and still today in primitive societies that are not in industrially and technologically advanced societies, they don't have a stage of life called adolescence. They have 2 stages. They have childhood and adulthood. When they reach puberty, they go through a test, men and women alike. They go through a test that is called a rite of passage. And if they pass the test, then they are marked in some way. They're circumcised or excised or tattooed or scarred or something, so that every person that encounters knows immediately by their markings, this is an adult. And therefore, they are eligible for adult privileges, but they are also eligible for adult consequences. If they are not so marked, then they are a child. And they are protected from the mistakes that they make because they're children. With the development of adolescence, we do not have a single rite of passage. We do not have a single marker or marking by which we can tell the players without scorecards. We have what's called rolling markers. And so kids get a high school diploma, kids get a job, kids get a car, kids go into the service, kids pay taxes. I mean, there are a lot of different markers by which they move towards adult standing and adult status. But adolescence as an artificial and protected stage of life is a direct outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution. Socialization a minute ago is the major expectation culturally of parenting. There are 4 skill sets that are supposed to occur in the socialization process. Children must learn anger management skills. Children must learn impulse control skills. Children must learn the ability to delay immediate gratification. And that's a real problem because we live in a society that fosters instant gratification. And your children have grown up with a sense of entitlement. And your children have grown up being expert consumers by the time they're 5 years old. By the time they're 5 years old, they know the good stuff that they're entitled to have. And they expect you to get it for them. uniform. And they will say things like, I won't wear that, that's not cool. And you have to deal with it. They'll say things like, I've got to have the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy is no longer cool. You've got to get the Game Boy Advance. Yeah, it's $100, but go to the maintenance money. Stupidest question I ever asked my child. Why did you spill your milk? How stupid is that? What's he going to do? He's going to look at me and say, oh no. I'm going to say, yes you do. You know why you spilled that milk. He's going to say, why did I spill the milk? I'm saying, because I'm looking at the opportunity to give a speech. So if I need to give a speech, just give the speech. If I need to say, I'm mad at you because you spilled your milk, don't need to say that. Don't ask a question. If you want to make a statement, make a statement. Don't ask stupid questions. Okay? So we talk about anger management, we talk about impulse control, we talk about delayed gratification, and then finally the acquisition of specific essential skills. How to drive a car, how to make change, how to work a microwave, how to use a computer. Well, those things change over time as our society evolves. But that's what children have to learn so that someday they can go out there. You say one of the most egregious things, one of the most common things parents get upset about is the tone of voice with which teenagers speak to them. You ever been out to the mall and listened to some teenager speak to his mom or dad in a scathing, sardonic voice that just makes them want to walk up and slap them? Would you ever ask yourself, why don't they know? Don't they have a mom, that teaches them? Hopefully, pray, it's not your child speaking to you. But what I see that. Well, what I see additionally is that oftentimes parents speak to their children in tones of voices that they would not speak to their dogs in. And I think that's crying shame. Watch your child, put boundaries around your child, be consistent in those, not perfect, just consistent. The law of averages over time. Have real consequences that you guys have thought about. Make a list. I recommend the ABC list, for hard consequences, mid-level consequences, minor consequences. Don't get caught up in an argument about the facts. Your kids are going to be good sea lawyers. Marital couples, want to do marriage counseling. One of the first things that we try to teach couples that are going through marital problems is quit arguing about the facts. If you're arguing about the facts, it's the third time this week that you've been on late for dinner, you've already lost the argument. That's not the point. The point is the feelings. Somebody is upset. Somebody doesn't feel loved or safe or appreciated. And that's what you have to address. Touch your children. Now, your adolescents are going to fight that. Mom, dad. Don't ignore it. One of the most fundamental ways that you know that you're okay as a human being is when people that love you touch you. Touch your children every day. Make them let you touch them. Somehow, some way. Touch them every day. Is that the two most salient criteria that are out there that are indicators of whether or not kids are going to use and abuse drugs and alcohol, the two factors that count most, number one, the regularity and frequency of church attendance. And number two, the regularity and frequency of family meetings. Take them to church, send them to church, make them sit down and eat with you. It is a serious problem. It is a pervasive problem. 9 out of 10 kids who die with alcohol in the bloodstream. Protect your child. Parent your child. Socialize your child. Love your child. And then let them go. Thank you very much.
Brett and I hope that you have enjoyed this special presentation of Psych with Mike. If you're listening to the podcast and you are interested in seeing what Brett and I looked like 20 years ago, you can go to the YouTubes and search Psych with Mike to get this episode. If anyone would like a full version of this presentation, let me know, and if enough people ask for it, I will put it together and post it. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.